Less than 72 hours ago from shooting this video, Tucker Carlson published his over 2-hour-long interview that he had with Russian President Vladimir Putin. By the end of this video, you'll be able to better understand the communication tips and tactics that both Putin and Tucker used so that we can better understand the significance of this moment and how they made it possible. It's important for me to note that this conversation is not my content, so I will be sharing very small clips, but the clips will be brief. As we go throughout this video, I'll start with minute 1 of the conversation and essentially pick out a few different things that really stuck out to me, and we're going to land at the end of the convo. This can be found on Tucker Carlson Network. If you want to watch the whole entire thing, you can watch it there. The transcript's there, the timestamps are there. It can also be found on YouTube, and it can be found on X. That being said, let's hop into it and let's hear how he introduces the conversation.
The following is an interview with the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, shot February 6, 2024 at about 7 p.m. in the building behind us, which is, of course, the Kremlin.
It's important for us to note the rhetorical situation here. Where did this happen? Who was there? When did it happen? And something that I want to highlight before we hop into this is that it happened in the Kremlin. So this is at Putin's home turf. All he really needs to do is wake up and he can walk to where this interview is happening. Tucker is on the complete opposite side of the world that he's used to. And we will see the illustration of this Western approach and this Eastern approach and how it collides. And really, the interview started pretty shaky for the first 20 minutes. And thankfully, they were able to work through that. But he talks about this. So this is before he even shows the interview. He feels the need to make this preface, which I thought was interesting.
The interview, as you will see if you watch it, is primarily about the war in progress, the war in Ukraine, how it started, what's happening, and most pressingly, how it might end. One note before you watch. At the beginning of the interview, we asked the most obvious question, which is, why did you do this? Did you feel a threat, an imminent physical threat? And that's your justification. And the answer we got shocked us. Putin went on for a very long time, probably half an hour, about the history of Russia going back to the 8th century. And honestly, we thought this was a filibustering technique and found it annoying.
And he interrupted him. And this is fascinating. I'll even show you where Putin himself says, hey, can I take like 20 seconds to answer this question?
So if you don't mind, I will take only 30 seconds or 1 minute to give you a short reference to history for giving you a little historical background.
Please.
All right. So this conversation is dubbed. So whenever Putin's talking, you're going to hear a different voice that was interpreted into English. But Putin begins the interaction by saying, hey, let me first take a minute or two and give a little bit of a historical background because that's going to base my answer. And Tucker, he obliges. He says, of course, please. But what we'll see is that this answer lasts over 20 minutes. And he goes and he goes and he goes. And I'll show you a couple different instances where Tucker's looking at him like this right here. Okay. And he even begins to interrupt him. So let's hear how he starts the answer, though.
And it is considered to be the year of the establishment of the Russian state in 862, when the townspeople of Novgorod invited a Varangian prince, Rurik, from Scandinavia to reign.
Putin begins this answer by going back to the year 862. He begins to tell us the formation of what is now known as Russia. And it starts with a prince and Scandinavia. Now, this is much different than what Tucker expected for this conversation. So let's see a couple interruptions that Tucker chooses to use.
Commissioned here, including to Kiev.
I beg your pardon, can you tell us what period? I'm losing track of where in history we are. The Polish oppression of Ukraine.
It was in the 13th century.
Ну вот, в 13 веке. Это был в 13 веке. Значит,
Now I will tell you what happened later.
дальше идет.
And then he goes back to his story. He says, okay, this was the answer, and here's what we're going to go back to. And there are several of these interruptions just in this first answer. For instance, I'll show you a different one.
The partitioning of Czechoslovakia.
But may I ask you, you're making the case that Ukraine, certainly parts of Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, is in effect Russia, has been for hundreds of years. Why wouldn't you just take it when you became president 24 years ago? You have nuclear weapons, they don't. If it's actually your land, why did you wait so long?
Sure. Да,
I'll tell you. I'm coming to that.
Okay, so Tucker tries to ask his initial question again, like, why now? And Putin's like, hey, I'm coming to that. And this all bubbles up to this little interaction that they have here. Look at this.
I understand that my long speeches probably fall outside of the genre of the interview. That is why I asked you at the beginning, are we going to have a serious talk or a show? You said a serious talk. So bear with me, please. We're coming to...
Now, he finally faces this last rebuttal by saying, hey, I understand I'm taking a while to answer, but are we going to have a serious talk or are we going to have a talk show moment? And as you can see, Tucker smiles, he laughs, and there's actually a lot of smiling and laughing that happens throughout this interaction. Putin is quite relaxed. He is in his home turf, as you can see.
What I want to talk about right now. It is a very important issue.
He's leaning over, talking about very important issues, but in a very chill manner almost. And there are a lot of moments where both he and Tucker share a laugh together. And this is really fascinating to me because obviously we know that this is a heated conversation with very heated topics, but it shows that sometimes one of the best ways to navigate tough topics is to be soft with the people and to laugh and to almost create an environment where you can go back and forth. But after the mix of these cultures and they kind of figured it out, Tucker begins to give Putin a little bit more time to answer. And it creates much more of a carefree, much more of a relaxed environment. This acknowledgement of two different cultures is very good for us to think about because if you look at the West versus the East, there's a lot of different communication patterns, and culture affects our communication. Communication really is a physical manifestation of what culture is. So in the West, if you look at, for instance, like Western literature, the most popular book would be, or one of them at least, right? Atomic Habits. I just read it, so it's on top of my mind. But I know that Atomic Habits was on the New York Times bestseller for several years. But then in the East, whenever you think about like Russian literature, you think of things like Tolstoy, you think of these big overarching narratives and concepts, being able to communicate those narratives and bringing home the message that way. So West is very action, pragmatic. Eastern is very much about abstract narrative, bringing together concepts and ideas to communicate. And this happened here. So if we don't recognize that our culture influences our communication and we don't accommodate to that, then we won't be able to have a great 2-hour conversation like they had. Another incredibly fascinating thing about this interaction is the use of story. So several times throughout this conversation, Putin specifically asks if he can share a story.
To get back to their historical land. Moreover, I would like to share a very interesting story with you. I digress. It's a personal one. Somewhere in the early 80s, I went.
So Putin says, hey, can I share a story with you? And this is whenever they're talking about the Ukrainian presence and the Russian presence in Ukraine and the mix of cultures and the history of the land. But Putin begins to answer this question by saying, whenever he was a kid, he traveled throughout the land of Russia and he saw the different cultures. But he asked this question, can I share with you a personal story? And as you see, Tucker's face.
It's a personal one. Somewhere in the early 80s,
Tucker's face really lights up. This is one of the biggest smiles, other than like the big laughs that he has. This is one of the biggest smiles. So it's fascinating to me because Putin can say just about whatever he wants to say. He's in his home turf. He clearly has the power factor here, yet he's choosing to use story to be able to communicate. And I think stories are one of the best ways to connect the two, right? To connect someone from a different side of the planet, or Putin realizes who's going to be listening or watching to this conversation. He does this several times.
Let me tell you a story about a person serving a sentence in an allied country of the US.
At this point, they're talking about a journalist that's currently in prison in Russia. And rather than going back and forth and arguing, Putin begins to share a story. But these stories may not always be prefaced with, hey, let me tell you a story. He actually shares a ton of stories about US presidents. For instance, he talks about a conversation that he had with Bill Clinton.
At a meeting here in the Kremlin with the outgoing president, Bill Clinton, right here in the next room, I said to him, I asked him, Bill, do you think if Russia asked to join NATO, do you think it would happen? Suddenly he said, it's interesting. I think so. But in the evening, when we met for dinner, he said,
So he talks about a conversation he has with Bill Clinton, and he shares, hey, here's what I said, and then here's what Bill said. But in the evening, he says that Bill changes his mind. And it was due to advisors from the NSA and the CIA that advised him to switch his direction.
No, I've talked to my team. No, it's not possible now. You can ask him. I think he will watch our interview. He'll confirm it. I wouldn't have said anything like that if it hadn't happened.
And this introduces something that Putin does a lot throughout this conversation. It's this idea of conversational framing. I want you to imagine a frame, and in this frame, there's a picture. The picture is a portrait of someone who, let's see here, they got two eyes, they got a little cap on, they're going to a certain place. Man, my drawing is horrendous. But there's stuff going on in the background. This portrait only captures this person at a certain moment in time. And we can't see anything else of this person. We can only see what's pictured. Now, people do this in conversation with conversational framing, and Putin does this a lot by sharing a historical account and saying, here's what I said, but you're going to have to ask the other person what they said. You need to ask him. Go ask them what they said. And it colors the perspective because it gives one side while not giving the other side. He does this several times.
After was invited by Bush Jr.'s father, Bush Sr., to visit his place on the ocean, I had a very serious conversation with President Bush and his team. I proposed that the United States, Russia, and Europe jointly create a missile defense system that...
So at this point, they're talking about a missile defense system in a conversation that he has with Bush. But as you can guess, whenever Tucker asks him, Tucker responds.
Serious.
Or Putin
I
responds.
said, absolutely.
Let me ask, what year was this?
I don't remember. It is easy to find out on the internet when I was in the USA at the invitation of Bush Sr.
After a little more discussion of presidents such as Bush and Clinton, Tucker asked the question, well, what's your relationship like with Biden? Have you contacted Biden recently? When was the last time you talked with Biden?
Well, yes, he funds, but I talked to him before the special military operation, of course. And I said to him then, by the way, I will not go into details, I never do, but I said to him then, I believe that you are making a huge mistake of historic proportions by supporting everything that is happening there.
And he tells Tucker, I've talked to him before. I know he's funding the war. I know he's funding Ukraine. And I told him a few things, but I won't go into details because it's confidential, and I never do. So it's more of this idea of shaping his perspective, not adding the other, but framing the conversation.
What did he say?
Ask him, please. It is easier for you. You are a citizen of the United States. Go and ask him. It is not.
So whenever Tucker says, well, what did Biden say back to you? He tells Tucker, well, hey, why don't you ask him? So it's withholding what's going on. It's interesting because he appeals to confidentiality, and he'll say, I said this, but I can't tell you the other thing because it's confidential. So it's like, even though it's confidential, I can still tell you what I said, but I'm not able to tell you what they said. And that perspective and framing it. And Tucker does this too, in the idea of figuring out what questions he wants to ask. Typically, the interviewer has the power in these settings because the interviewer gets to determine what's discussed. So we can look at some of Tucker's questions. They're typically really sharp, really quick.
Theology.
Would you be satisfied with the territory that you have now?
Very quick. Would you be satisfied with the territory you have now? If we look at the conversation, Putin talks about 95% of the time. Now, for an interview, you would expect the person being interviewed to talk more, but the extreme is really evident here. Here's another question.
It seems to me that this is much smarter and more rational.
Who blew up Nord Stream?
You for sure.
It was busy that day. Nate, I did not blow up Nord Stream.
Okay, he says, who blew up Nord Stream? And Putin responds, hey, you did it. So the playful banter and going back and forth combined with Tucker's quick questions, it's interesting how Tucker, as the interviewer, is trying to keep the conversation flowing in certain directions. He's framing the conversation while Putin is also answering these questions by providing his perspective, maybe withholding other perspectives. And I don't expect either of them to be able to give a comprehensive example of any of this, because that's why it's so complicated. That's why conversations such as these are important, because we get to chip away at what we should do. But it's so fascinating watching both of these people address this topic, and Tucker asking the questions, Putin giving the answers, and then them coming together. But seeing the laughs and seeing the smiles really stuck out to me. Here's another example of Putin using a bit of a story to be able to frame the conversation. He talks about a conversation he had with Zelensky.
His father fought against the fascists, Nazis, during World War II. I once talked to him about this. I said, Volodya, what are you doing? Why are you supporting neo-Nazis in Ukraine today, while your father fought against fascism? He was a frontline soldier. I will not tell you what he answered. This is a separate topic. And
so he says, I asked him, why aren't you fighting off the Nazis in your country? And I can't tell you what he said. So again, providing the question, yet not providing the answer, and framing the conversation in a way. So be it the mix of cultures or the conversational framing or the use of story, several times throughout this interaction, my ears really perked up. Both of these conversationalists are doing things to push them closer to addressing this topic. And it may be seen as some type of manipulation, or it may be seen as some type of mockery, whatever that looks like. Both of them are trying to accomplish a task. And this conversation stuck out to me, and I found it very intriguing and interesting. If you are interested in watching it yourself, go check it out. It's on YouTube, it's on X, it's on Tucker Carlson Network. And let me know if there's any other thing that I should be looking at, if there's another communication situation or rhetorical moment that I should be wondering what's going on there. And I'd love to be able to assess it. So thanks for sticking around. Thanks for watching all this. It's been a blast, and I'll see you next time.